All right, well, thank you for having me. Can everybody hear me okay? If at any point I wander away from the microphone, just point me back. I'm pleased to be here this evening to talk about what I think is maybe a lesser known part of the Collingwood Shipyards operation. I know we're all very familiar with the launch photographs that are on the main street, on murals and in restaurants, but pictures like this that show ships in the course of repair or reconstruction are often not shown as much, and surprisingly, I don't know of many things that have actually been written about the dry docks operation. So in preparing this presentation, the staff at the museum really relied on photographs that we have, because we do have a very rich photograph collection at the museum. And every time I do a presentation here, I'm always very eager to talk about the Huron Institute. And that was the museum's predecessor, which started in 1904. And because of that early group of local residents who started collecting the history, it's preserved for today, and that is the foundation of the Collingwood Museum's collection. So without further ado, I would like to talk to you today about two rectangular inlets in our harbor that most people associate with the ship launches, the side launch specifically. But in fact, they had a very different, indeed almost an operation completely unto themselves. That was part of the shipyard's success from 1883 until its closure in 1986. And this photograph is courtesy of George Zerny, and it was taken not so long ago. The shipyard development here has certainly progressed quite a bit more, but those inlets are today what they appear here from the air. So this is a diagram from the town of Collingwood's official plan, and this is just to give you an idea of what these areas are zoned as today. So this is the launch basin, and you can see that, sorry for my shaking hand, there's the green line around it, and this is part of the Collingwood Trail System, and that is designated parkland. You'll see that this here, however, this is the original dry dock that you're going to see some pictures of. On the right side of it, that is zoned, you can't actually read it there, medium density residential. And then in the red here, this is zoned commercial. So these are the present zonings that the town of Collingwood has put on these properties that was once part of the Collingwood Shipyards operation, again for 103 years. And I should note that the upcoming Perfect World Collingwood development is slated for this piece of land right here. And that is 3 6-story buildings, for anyone who isn't aware. So I agreed to do this presentation in September 2018 when Bruce Mackison came into the office, and I was telling him about an assignment I was working on for the courses through the University of Victoria that I've been doing. And for a heritage resource course, I chose to do the dry docks because they were something that I really didn't know a whole lot about, and I knew the museum had a lot of photographs, and surprisingly, these are the only 2 structures left on our harbor front from Collingwood shipbuilding industry. A lot of people think that the Collingwood terminals was part of the shipyards operation, and they were very different operations. So these rectangular inlets in our harbor are really the only things that we have left from along the harbor front from this industry. So for my assignment, I went out in June of 2018 and took pictures of what they look like today. So dry dock number 1, which is on the left, it is the rectangular inlet that runs right along Heritage Drive, so the road that goes out to the Collingwood terminals. And as you can see, we're looking north towards the terminals there. And it does come pretty much right up to Side Launch Way, which is quite surprising actually. It's difficult to get a picture of because it is in part of the land that is inaccessible right now. And then the other picture to the right is of what would become known as the launching basin, but surprisingly it actually was also a dry dock. And that part of our history has actually been, I feel, largely forgotten. It's not until you speak to shipyard workers who started at the shipyards in the late 40s or early 50s that they remember the dry dock's operation, a lot of people, this is no longer in our memory, and it's the pictures in the museum collection and personal collections that really have captured this history. So this is a picture taken at the southernmost point of that launching basin looking north, and that shipyard development that was on the in George's aerial photograph is there. And again, this is the promenade trail heading south towards the main street, which is right here. So these are those basins that we're talking about. This slip, which the largest of Collingwood ships was launched into, and then the quite magnificent structure on. Last time I did a presentation, it was my phone that was ringing. I don't think it's mine this time. But this structure here, it's actually been in operation continuously until the closure of the shipyard from 1883 to 1986. And it was actually the opening of this structure in 1883 on the Queen's birthday, May 24th, that the Collingwood Shipyards took as that was their origin date. So they lasted for 103 years. They took 1883 as the beginning. So the construction of the dry dock was the beginning of, in a lot of ways, it all. And I don't know the exact date that this photograph was taken, but it shows a very, very early Collingwood Harbor. We have our second grain terminal in the background, and today's Heritage Drive would be over here. And again, this is that rectangular inlet that comes all the way up to here, Ontario Street. And this is the earliest known photograph that we have of this construction process. And as I've been calling it number 1 dry dock. It was originally called the Queen's Dry Dock because of its opening date. And certainly when the second dry dock was constructed, it became number 1, and then the new one was number 2. On the day of the opening of the Queen's Dry Dock, there was believed to be 5,000 people in Collingwood that day. It was part of a day of celebrations in honor of Queen Victoria, and it's reported that the Collingwood band and the Meaford band played aboard this seemingly small ship, and they were on the deck, and it was quite a celebration, and the people of Collingwood seemed to know that the opening of this dry dock meant great things for the community. And I'll just say that at the time, the steamship Oneida, which was the first ship to enter the dry dock, it was described to be a huge boat. And when you think about the ships that would be constructed in Collingwood later on, this is quite quaint, but a very appropriate beginning for the shipyard. And this early shipyard, the earliest dry dock, it was 60 feet wide, 325 feet long, and 14 feet in depth from the sill where the dry dock gate would settle. And in 1910, Collingwood was launching 500 feet long ships. So you can see that even in 1883, 320 feet was quite impressive, and this ship here was 215 feet in length. And I just zoomed in on this picture because it looks a bit more substantial when you zoom in. And this scene of a ship in the course of having repairs done, this ship actually received damage by fire, so that was the occasion for it entering the dry dock. You also see a ship being constructed on the side, on the building berth. And that was what seemed to be so ingenious about the idea to create the dry dock. And I have a quote here that I'll share with you. "It is proposed by the enterprising proprietors to fill in and level a large space at one side of the dry dock for a shipbuilding yard, the operations of which will be controlled by Mr. Andrews. On the other side of the dock, a slip will be excavated and a wharf constructed, so that when the whole is finished, Collingwood will be furnished with a dry dock and all the accessories thereto, whose equal cannot be found in Canada." Now at this time, there was the government dry dock in Kingston that was larger than this dry dock, but other than that, Collingwood is reported to have had one of the largest dry docks on lakes. In 1884, the Queen's Dry Dock is listed as being in Collingwood, Ontario, in the R.L. Polk and Company's Marine Directory of the Great Lakes as one of 7 Ontario dry docks. The other dry docks included Deseronto, Garden Island, Kingston, Owen Sound, Port Dalhousie, Port Robinson, and St. Catharines, which is the Chicluna Shipyard, which for anyone who attended Professor Kimberly Monk's presentation, that is the shipyard that she's been working to excavate as part of a grant that she received through Brock University. And then I will point out just some of these other structures. This was the first pump house. Of course, with the dry dock, all the water had to be pumped out of the dock, which was quite a process, because to get the ship in, well, first of all, you had to have the docking plan for the ship's hull, so that when the ship was brought in and the water drained out, the ship would actually settle on the keel blocks that would be arranged specifically to receive that ship's design. And of course, every ship has its own design, so every ship that entered these dry docks had its own docking plan. And some of the other pictures that we get to when we see the activity, logistically thinking about how these ships were coming in and out and the preparations involved, it's quite fascinating. S.D. Andrews is the gentleman in that quotation that I read that is credited with the early operation of the shipyard. This is the only photograph that we have of him, and unfortunately I don't know the year that this was taken. So he did, shortly after the shipyard, or the dry dock started operating, he did shift his interest in the company to his partner, who had the last name of Silcox. Unfortunately I didn't write down his first name and I can't remember what it was. And Mr. Silcox continued to manage the operation until 1889. And this was all done under a financing agreement with the town of Collingwood. And as long as the company could control the dry dock, as long as it didn't sit idle for more than 8 months. And originally when the dry dock was constructed, the town issued a $25,000 grant to put towards the construction of the dry dock. And according to Skip Gillum, the complete cost of that project was $35,000. I don't know the original source of that price, but it's something that we're going to continue to search for at the museum. So Mr. Andrews gave the operation to his partner Silcox, who operated for a little longer, and then in March of 1889, the management reverted to the town because indeed the dry dock was sitting idle. It was then that these 3 men came into play, and Captain Pete Campbell on the left there, he's quite a storied legend on the lakes, racing ships and blowing the paint off the smokestacks and such, saving people from shipwrecks. He was one of the men that then leased the land from the town, joined by Thomas Long, and the Long brothers had a very successful business in Collingwood and Toronto, and I believe out west as well. And then Charles Cameron, who's pictured on the right. And they formed, in September of 1889, the Dry Dock and Wrecking Company. The shipyards went through various name changes. I'm not going to go through all of them. Some of them will inevitably come in, but the Dry Dock and Wrecking Company was what they called their operation. Now, all of these men were also part owners of the Great Northern Navigation Company, and this was the company that was organizing the passenger vessels in and out of Collingwood, because of course Collingwood was a very busy spot, being the northern terminus of the railway and having direct access to American cities via passenger vessel. And over the course of their management of the shipyard, they built many well-known steamers, including the Majestic and the Germanic. And this is a photograph of the Germanic, which is a large wooden steamer, actually the last wooden ship to be built in Collingwood, being constructed in the dry dock. And something that was always really confusing for myself, I won't speak to the rest of the staff, but we could never figure out, the first side launch pictures that we have are of the Huronic. And that was the first steel ship. We've never seen side launch photographs of the wooden steamers. And I was flipping through Reflections in preparation for this presentation, which is a book by Barbara Arp. And this picture jumped out, and indeed it was actually constructed in the dry dock. I don't know of any steel ships that were constructed in the dry docks like this, but at this time this was done, and I don't know the logistics of launching a wooden ship sideways and how the wood responds to that kind of stress, but I don't know if that's the reason, but certainly these early ships were actually built in the dry dock. And this picture is from 1889. And this is, unlike our dynamic launch photographs, the side launch photographs, this is a launch photograph of the Majestic. So presumably the Majestic was built in the same way as the Germanic. And to launch this ship, all that was done was that the gate was removed, and not removed, it would be lifted, and the dry dock would slowly flood, the ship would rise, and a launch, unlike the launches that we're used to from seeing again all of the photographs, such as this one. This is the launch of the Huronic. This is the first steel ship launched in Collingwood. And again, you see the terminal building in the background. And this is being launched into the original dry dock. This is still dry dock 1. Dry dock 2 hasn't been created yet. But so an interesting point, if you're ever looking at side launch photographs, you can tell by the way the ship launches which dry dock it's being launched into. And this is launching west or towards the mountains, so this is the Queen's dry dock. If they're launching east towards Sunset Point, that's dry dock number 2. And you just have to be careful that someone hasn't flipped a negative, because then the ship will be launching the wrong way and will change history. There are some other ways to keep them separate, and I'll explain a little bit about that as we go. So prior to this launch, there was actually an expansion of the dry dock. So this is 1901. The original dry dock was 1883. The town put up a bonus of $50,000 to establish a steel shipbuilding facility and to increase the dry dock to, and my reference or my resources differ a little here, whether it's 500 feet or 550 feet, but adding a substantial amount, almost doubling the size of the length of the original dry dock. And this launch happened on September 12th, 1901, which, when I was writing the subtitle, the shipyard closed on September 12th, 1986. And I thought that was quite an interesting piece of information. I don't know if it factored into their date of closure, but when you think about the first steel ship launching and then that being the date of the shipyard's closure, it could be possible. I don't know if there's anything there. And then, actually, I'm going to go back. So this is the Queen's dry dock here, flooded for the purpose of receiving the ship. There's this odd piece of land, oddly shaped piece of land between what we know of today as the launching basin and the Queen's dry dock. I found a picture that shows the other side of that, which is this. So what we see here is that slip that was referenced in that early quotation about the early operation of the dry dock. And you can see here that even on this side, there are boats being constructed, and this is believed to be the steamer yacht Emma, which was constructed by Robert Morrill in Collingwood Harbour in 1894. And I understand that the Morrill family rented land, or they rented property where the building berth is here for their operation, whereas the Watts family owned land along the other dry dock that they constructed their boats on. I didn't have a chance to really dig into that, but I understand that the Watts owned property and the Morrills, they rented it. And I'd also like to mention that the earliest reference to the Hurontario slip is found actually in 1880, which predates the dry dock's construction date. And it's in the Huron Institute catalog, and it just says Hurontario Street Slip, Schooner Cathodin. And I could not find that photograph. I've never seen it before, so it's on our wanted list at the museum. As some of you will know, the early museum experienced a fire, and the collection wasn't it was damaged from water in the fire, but it wasn't damaged from the fire itself. And in some cases, we're still finding some of the things that were filed in interesting places by volunteers. And indeed, we're often waiting for, actually some of those pieces went to private residences in Collingwood to be saved and protected. And in some cases, we continue to get those back. So if you ever find any pictures that have writing on them, especially numbers in the top corners, those are probably part of the museum's original collection, and we'd love to have them back to reunite the collection. This is the earliest map I could find that actually shows the slip, and here you'll see this is the dry dock. And until I saw this picture, I will admit that I had no idea it was directly in line with St. Paul Street. Because when you're looking directly at it, and I drive up St. Paul Street every day that I work, and I've never appreciated the fact that that original dry dock is dead on, straight there. And then you see here, this is here on Ontario Street, and there is the slip, and it's labeled as such. And this is a portion of a map that actually is at the Simcoe County Archives. But again, it was this map that made me realize that that's why they're at such an odd angle. One follows the line of St. Paul Street, the other follows the line of here Ontario Street. And this is one of our earliest pictures that we know of this slip. So here's the flooded Queen's Dry Dock on the right, and then there is the very early slip. So they were still launching ships, small ships, boats, arguably, into that basin, but things were going to change. Before we get to the construction of the second dry dock, this is a relatively recent donation. These photographs came in 2015, and they're actually quite old, from 1897, and they were beautiful condition. And these are arguably two of the best photographs that show a ship in dry dock. And you can see that the ship is supported. So when I was talking about a docking plan, all of these wedges and blocks had to be set up to support the weight of the keel when that ship was lowered as a result of the dry dock being pumped. And you can see how people, I got really far ahead. You can see how people were getting in and out of the dry dock. They were just ladders. And there are some other perspectives that actually show steps in the stone. And this will become one of the definitive differences between the first dry dock and the second dry dock, is this stone, which we believe is still there. This was constructed in 1883. We have some pictures coming up from the 80s, and that stone's there 100 years later. And I feel like it's still there today. But so looking at the sides of the dry dock here, it's possible to determine whether it's the original one or the second one. We'll see that the second one actually comes straight down, and it's concrete, and these ones are more on a slope, and it's rock. So on the left here, you can note how busy the dry dock is. So here we have, this is the harmonic is on the stocks here, on the building berth to the east of the dry dock. It was launched in 1908, so it's about that time. And you can see that right beside it, there are two ships undergoing repairs. So before that ship could be launched, those would have to be taken out. And interestingly, the ships were built in the middle of, it was a traveling crane that built these ships. And you can see that there's what looks like scaffolding here. And here you see it on both sides of the harmonic. And before that ship could be launched, they'd actually have to dismantle that part of the traveling crane, which I can't imagine was an easy feat. But it's noticeably absent here. And this is a very popular photograph. At one point we had a sign on the main street that was a promotion for the museum that featured this launch. And Starbucks has this picture from the museum collection on their walls, as do other private residences and businesses in Collingwood. But what's interesting is you can see here, like there's the side of the basin, and here's the other side. Though there's not a lot of room for air, there's no room for air there. And indeed, crashing into the side of the basin would necessitate the pumping out of the dry dock and the repairs to the ship. So the way that ships were launched here is quite unique, and a lot of that is due to the fact that they were launched into the flooded dry docks. The Midland Shipyard also did side launches, as did a lot of other communities, but Midland launched directly into the bay. They didn't launch into a basin, so they didn't have the same visual impact that Collingwood did, but it also meant that there was a greater room for error in this way. And this is one of my favorite photographs. It was the picture on the main screen when we started. This is the Queen's Dry Dock, #1 dry dock. But unfortunately, there's no date. We don't know anything about this photograph other than it's from the perspective of the terminals, and you can see the ship here being built. So we believe that would be dry dock #1. But again, it just shows how congested the space is and how important the dry docks were for bringing revenue into the shipyard's operation. It wasn't just building ships, it was repairing ships that they needed. Now this is one of the, not only, but the earliest photographs we have of the #2 dry dock construction. And this is believed to have been taken in 1909. There are conflicting dates to this. I think there's a descriptor of this photograph that says 1902. There's another that says 1904, one that says 1909. So again, we're trying to figure out if one maybe shows more of an expansion than an original construction photograph. But, and also you might remember this picture from something you've read about the first dry dock, and this was actually for a long time misidentified as the Queen's Dry Dock construction, but it's most definitely is not. This is the Hurontario Street, the dry dock that would be at the north end of Hurontario Street. And it's fascinating when you zoom in on these pictures because you can see all of the horses, and sometimes you can catch the workers doing interesting things. Sometimes children make their way into photographs. But even in the course of putting this presentation together, Lindsay, my colleague, is here, and we were talking about how you do this. Like, there is a body of water here. That is a ship at the north end of what they are creating. And the engineering and logistics of all of this is quite astounding, even for today. And when we get to the latter part of the presentation, there are some photographs of the expansion that happened in the 1980s to the original dry dock. And from those, you can visualize how they did that, because even though that dry dock was built quite a long time ago, the way that they repaired ships and prepared for ships coming in and leaving, it didn't change very much at all, actually. Here's another photograph, and here you can see the the vertical walls of this dry dock, and I love this. I love the crane here. And looking in the background is always fun. There's a lot of activity going on. It's actually a dredge here, and there's a Greg McGordy in Collingwood. I don't think Greg's here, but his family, or his wife's family actually, was involved in the Boone Dredging Company. And we've been finding their dredges in the backgrounds of a lot of the photographs. So there's always a lot of activity. They received government funding to actually help dredge out Collingwood Harbour, and they seem to be a pivotal part of the harbour's development from the early 1900s onward. Here's another photograph looking towards, again, the terminal. And again, very different walls than the first one. And this is dated November 6th, 1909. So again, this could, I don't know if this is showing a possible expansion on the dock that could have been created earlier. There's a lot of unknown details here. However, this next photograph is dated just a month later in 1909, and this is perhaps one of the best photographs of dry dock #2 that we have. And of course, here's Main Street, there's the clock tower, the shipyard buildings along Huron Street that people would remember before they came down in the 1990s. And a great shot of the dry dock gate. And again, in the course of doing this presentation, I've been speaking with shipyard workers, specifically Barry Underdown. He's been trying to, it's hard to understand how all of these different things worked. And the gate itself was actually hollow, and it would be filled with water that would weigh it down into the sill that it would sit. And it would be, the water would be released from it for it to rise and open. And I've never really thought about how a dry dock gate operates before, and it's an interesting thing to try to wrap your mind around. We have a set of insurance plans at the museum that are very valuable to the community as a resource for residential inquiries or business inquiries. And they show buildings and what they were largely composed of between 1904 and 1917. So they were originally created in 1914, but if you hold them up to the light, you can see what was added by being glued over the original. So it's always fun to do some detective work. But here you can see that here's Huron Street, and here is the original dry dock, Queen's Dry Dock or Dry Dock number 1, and then, oh, here it is. Here Ontario Street is here, and then there's our second dry dock. And these maps are also interesting because they label all of these original shipyard buildings, which we have in photographs, but because this only is updated to 1917, none of the workers that we've created relationships with, they weren't there in 1917, so they may know where a building was moved to, but they may not have known what its original function was. So we do have another series of these insurance plans from 1955, and I didn't include the 1955 one because there largely is no change. Dry Dock 2 is still functioning as a dry dock in 1955, but it's sometime in the late 1950s that it ceases operating as such, and it goes back to strictly being a launch basin. And this ship, the Emperor, launched in 1910, is believed to be the first large ship launched into dry dock number 2, the flooded dry dock number 2. So this would be, if you're walking on the trail, you'd be walking on the building berth where that ship was created, on the promenade. And this was Collingwood's first ship over 500 feet, and this is 1910. And around this time, Collingwood breaks a lot of records for Canadian shipyards at this time in the length of their ships. Just 3 years later, in 1913, the James Carruthers was constructed, and it was the largest of its time. And sadly, it lasted less than 6 months, and it was lost in the Great Storm of 1913. Here's a great photograph, probably taken from the elevator, looking back towards the town. And so you can see there's the original Queen's Dry Dock with the gate and, of course, a ship there. This is the second pump house. The original pump house for the first dry dock was located on this side. There's that traveling crane system that I was talking about where they would build the ships. And then here is an empty dry dock with a ship in it. And again, there's the other traveling crane where the ships were launched. And there's here Ontario Street. Again, the shipyard buildings, and recently we've discovered that this was called the town dock, and this is the freight shed for the Grand Trunk Railway. So it's neat to see, I showed a former shipyard worker this photograph, and he worked at the shipyard for quite a number of years, but he'd never seen the dry dock number 2 empty before. He didn't know that it actually operated as such, so it's really interesting to see how parts of the history of what we have in our harbor front has maybe disappeared from some memories or maybe wasn't known to some at all. I don't really know why this photograph was taken, but it was taken in 1918. And again, this is in dry dock, the Queen's Dry Dock. You can see the stone here, and they kind of actually form a staircase almost. But this photograph is fascinating because you look at the series of blocks and how this ship, the entire weight of the ship is supported in the base of the dock. And I don't know, actually I do know what happened to, no I don't know. I was looking up some of the ship's histories to figure out how they were damaged, and I don't know why this one was in why it was in the dry dock. I don't know what repairs were being done. Possibly something that was documented by the shipyard. This picture came from the shipyards, so they could have been documenting something that they fixed. Now, there is some significant damage in the next photograph. This poor guy, the Saxona, it collided with a propeller on May 14th, 1917, and it's in the Collingwood shipyard for some serious repairs. It actually sank and then was raised and then brought to the shipyard to be fixed. So the whole front end here, just in case you didn't notice, is quite smashed in. So they did significant repairs. It wasn't just replacing the damaged hull plates. It was reforming the entire fronts or backs or sides of ships. And this photograph kind of demonstrates that as well. Now this ship, the Vinmount, it was stranded, suffered fire in the steering room of the engine room on November 2nd, 1918. Now this photograph, again, we have so many mysteries. February 18, I don't know if that's February 1918 or February 18th in an unknown year. The ship also had many different names, and it's hard to track. Sometimes the name that is written on a photograph isn't necessarily the name of the ship at the time that it was being worked on, so this is another one of our mystery files. And then I love this photograph, and this is becoming a really popular one for people to purchase for their home. It shows I love the perspective of this one. You see how small the men here are, and then you see the ships kind of bobbing in the background in the water, which I love. And this also points out that, like today, when we come on you never know what the weather's going to be like when you come to a Historical Society meeting in the winter. These poor workers they worked. The Shipyards was a year-round operation. They didn't stop because the weather was cold or hot. They worked in all seasons and in all different types of weather. I do know that this ship was lengthened. It was first rebuilt in Collingwood and then lengthened in 1924, which is happening when this photograph was taken. The Collingwood shipyard employees were very talented, and not only did they build the ships, but they often built a lot of the tools they needed. They also built the dry dock gates. So this photograph is the only mention we have of a new gate being created for dry dock number 1. And we just happened upon it when we were looking for something else in our archives, and thought it would be a good one to include. And here you can see the water tower at the shipyards. And I believe that's a large coal pile. And I don't know offhand, this would be number 1 dry dock that we're looking at. These are some impressive photographs of number 2 dry dock, the one that's in line with Hurontario Street. And this ship, you'll notice, has a missing section. And I believe it's being extended, and that is the new section that it's going to be added. It was actually extended and then reduced in size again. So I'm not quite sure what's happening here, if it's being extended or if it's being reduced, but here it is in the dry dock with the gate in 1939, I believe, and yeah, 1939. And here it is again, a great aerial shot with the terminals, which are relatively new on the scene in that photograph. I think that's the first one we have with that in the background. So these are some examples of the photographs that we have that speak to what happened in the shipyard. And to go along with these photographs, we actually have a collection of dry dock diaries. And no one at the museum's really had a chance to dive into these, to go through them, but I did just pull out a couple pages for the purpose of the presentation. This one's from 1932, and this one's from 32 and 33. I don't know offhand the years that we have for these, but it literally documents when a ship comes in, how many days it's there for. I was noticing this afternoon, this records the water level from the sill, so where the gate settles on the sill to the top of the water. And I don't know, not all of them record that, but I do know that was of great concern, particularly during the launches, because if a ship was long enough, and the Hochelaga, which was launched in 1949, is an example of this, if it's too long, part of the ship can catch that sill. And indeed, the Hochelaga struck the sill, and it had to have repairs done after the launch. And that's part of the reason why dry dock number 2 was reverted to a slip, because it just wasn't long enough, and the demand for longer ships, it just couldn't be used in that way anymore. It did continue to receive the biggest of Collingwood ships because it was wider than the original one. So even with the many changes to the dry docks, they continue to experience problems in the increasing capacity of ships and the depth of our harbor and what was actually possible there. Now, in addition to the dry dock diaries that would have come from the shipyard, we also have some interesting albums from the shipyard, and I apologize for the glossy pictures here. They're taken with my iPhone. Some of those scrapbooks are very difficult to scan properly and safely. These are leather-bound albums, and these are from 1939, and they show the interior of the dry dock. So this is dry dock number 1, the Queen's Dry Dock, and you can see that distinctive stone dating back to 1883, and there are the staircases that I don't think they're there anymore. We were trying to think if it was possible, but this is the north ends, I believe, and with the numerous expansions both ways, I don't think that the original stairs could be there because the dry docks were expanded. But it is interesting to note this is a new addition. This concrete here, the slope, that was not part of the original, so I don't know the reason that was added, but albums like this documenting the condition, they do help us continue to identify other photographs in the collection. Now, these are photographs of the newer dry dock number 2, and you can see that they're very vertical sides and no stone at all, it's just concrete. So these were the better versions of the, there were a lot of photographs, and I didn't think you'd want to see 20 photographs just of the the one, or the 2 dry docks, because there's some pretty exciting photographs coming up actually that I'd like to share with you. And their color, which is pretty rare for us, and these are really exciting because this was an album donated to the museum by Barry Underdown, and the photographs were taken by another shipyard worker. I believe Barry's actually in some of these photographs, but this shows the 1981 expansion of the dry dock. The shipyard closed in 1986, and in 1981 they were investing quite a bit of money into expanding the size of the length of the original 1883 dry dock. So again, it wasn't the 1909 one that they were working on, it was the very first one. And when I did an interview with Barry, and he mentioned that there was an expansion in the 70s too on the same dry dock. So there was a lot of work, again, continually trying to meet the needs of the shipping community. And this album is lovely because it has 6 photographs, all of the same size on each side, and they're mostly labeled. And I can't read it up here. I didn't actually adjust I'm realizing now, the focus on that. I hope it's okay for you. But this shows the dry dock renovations in June of 1981, specifically the creation of a cofferdam, which was my word of the day. I didn't know what that was. And so here you can see it's in the process of being constructed to, again, block off an area so that it can be drained of water and they can actually expand the length. And so when we were looking at those earlier photographs of the second dry dock and thinking about the ships in the background and how were they engineering this, they most likely built a cofferdam to do the same thing. And so here you can see it coming around, and then this was from another page, but it does show the completed piece there. And of course, there's Sunset Point over here, and this is Heritage Drive. And so once they completed the cofferdam, they pumped out the original dry dock here. And that's the process, again, of pumping out, and you can see that that's the cofferdam that they created for the expansion. And for anyone who was here during these years, I'm sure you're picking up the shear legs in the background. The shear legs were used to lower boilers into the ships. And I think they appeared on the harbor front around World War II when the corvettes were being created at the shipyard. Before that, there was a very rudimentary structure that was just like 2 beams with a top that would kind of lean over the dry dock. We have a few pictures of those, but anyway, that's just a nice feature in the background. But this is digging out the original dry dock slip walls, and I just included that in quotations here because that's what this page was labeled. And this is that 1883 lovely stone that sadly is just being ripped off the sides. But in looking at the pictures, it does appear that some of it actually went back on. And then here is the interesting process of re-cribbing the east side with steel. And in some of these pictures, you can actually see that there was the 1970 extension was steel as well, and then this 1981 extension is further, going further with steel. And there's also here the new dry dock bottom. So this has now been completely dug out, and there's the east wall there in place. And this is a really interesting shot. This is behind the wall, so this would be on the east side of that dry dock. And this was where I started to understand what that sill was, because I didn't understand in the descriptions what they were talking about and why the sill was such a concern when they were launching the ship. So this is kind of laying the foundation for the sill where the dry dock gate would stay. But then you look here, and even though your depth in the dry dock is maybe able to accommodate a ship, you have to factor in this raised part here. Even getting ships in and out, you'd have to be quite conscious of the water levels at the time. And so this is the sill going in for the new dry dock gate. This is the old dry dock gate. So this is actually a photograph going back before the cribbing, or the cofferdam was created. And there's a couple big ships in the background here with the terminals. There's another one there, presumably unloading. And this is the old dry dock. So the old gate. They pulled it into the dry dock. I think on Facebook I've actually seen things being burnt in the dry dock. Like there were a lot of. It would be a great spot to have a fire, I guess, because it's not going to catch fire. But here the old gate is being cut apart, and you can see it's completely hollow. So it was indeed filled, and then that would help secure it in the sill and keep it in place. And Barry said that the pressure of the lake against it, the bay, would also help keep it in place, thereby creating the environment that you needed for the dry dock. And then I included this full page because I thought it was cute and sad. It's going, gone, and going, gone. And then it ended up at the town dump. And it seems that in 1981, this looks like it's part wood. That doesn't look like the entire gate, so I'm not quite sure where the metal components went, but presumably they were scrapped. And then, in true form, the Shipyards creates its own dry dock gate. And this was happening at the same time, just on the side of the dry dock as it was being expanded. And you can see again, there's the framing for it. And then as it's covered. And then the process of using the crane to relocate it. Also, you'll notice it was painted. And then it goes into the bay. And there it is in place in the completed expanded dry dock from 1981. And then this was the first vessel here to go in the newly renovated dry dock in October 81. And I didn't point this out, but it's strikingly familiar, short of some of these keel blocks being concrete, whereas in the earliest photographs of the dry dock they were wood. It's still the same. They're still using what look like trees to prop to make sure the boat doesn't shift. And the only difference is they have the gangplank here, and I believe there's one on the other side there. And interesting fact, some of our bridges on our trail system are actually gangplanks from the shipyards. And we're always looking for neat photographs of those, because I think we need to do some interpretive science to bring that to people's attention, because it is an example of something that could potentially be lost. I only know that because Barry told me. And it's not a question I would ever think to ask. It just came out in a conversation. And these pieces, and even over the harbor, there's a lot of original pieces from the shipyard. Those keel blocks, some of those keel blocks, I believe, are still out there. And we've got a lot of work to do to continue to identify these things. But speaking of Barry, I had the pleasure to go for a stroll with Barry along the harbor in last year in the summer. It was a very hot day. So this was part one of our discussion. I just have a 2-minute clip because Barry actually experienced the dry dock. And there's a really great part of this very brief conversation where he imitates the sound of the dry dock being pumped out. And you can't read that, and you wouldn't even know to ask someone that. So I'm just going to jump over to where the projector is, and yeah, I'll take this. I think it'll work. I'm just going to make sure the volume's up so you can hear it. And it was a windy day, so I apologize for the wind that you'll hear. How long did it take to pump the dock again? I know you told me.
I'm thinking 6 or 8 hours, something around that line.
Wow.
And you could hear it.
Yeah.
Because the pump was run by, the engine was run by air.
Yeah.
It was like a...
And how loud was that? Like you could hear that?
You could hear that all over the yard when they started the pump. In fact, there were people that, when they heard that, would come over to the dock because they knew they were pumping.
Yeah.
And then when it got down fairly low, the water level, that you could get down in maybe with rubber boots. And they would look around to see what types of fish would be in there. They eventually would bring the Ministry of Natural Resources in.
Yeah.
And the conservation officer would stand up on the top and watch. And if there were fish, then they would have to be taken out and put back on this side of the gate.
How often would the dock have been used? Like how often would it have been pumped and filled?
It would depend on how much dry dock work you had.
Yeah.
It could be sporadic. Something could happen. The ship ran into trouble somewhere, and this was the closest place to go, or the only place to go because other docks were busy.
Yeah.
So, in later years, it wasn't as busy. Part of that was because ships were getting bigger.
Yeah.
Ships couldn't come back anymore after they left here because they couldn't come in here loaded.
Yeah.
Couldn't come to the elevator because there wasn't enough water for them.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of, I think when this expansion took place, it kind of boosted everybody's hopes that things were, and I guess maybe that's what they hoped for.
So Barry was talking about that 1981 expansion, and who would have thought that 5 years later the shipyard would close? And he went on to talk about seeing plans for another dry dock after 1981. So it's an unfortunate thing. When the shipyard did close, in the letter that went out to the staff, the lack of a large dry dock was included as one of the reasons. And it was one of the reasons that was seemingly unsurmountable that led to the yard's closure. But we have quite a few pieces still in Collingwood that I wasn't truly aware of. And one of them is at the north end of the museum. This sits outside, and it was identified by Sonny Potts, a former worker, as the hand winch for dry dock number 1. So one of the original gates, I don't know if it was the original gate, but one of the very early gates, it was saved. And right now it's at the north end of a building representing a train station with no interpretation, so no one knows what this is. And it just again happened because of a conversation. And that stroll that I did with Barry, we walked along the harbor for an hour and a half, and I just had a mic. So if you ever want to interview someone, we have a great mic. And we would loan it to you if you could, if you were interested in interviewing people, because we have quite a list of people that we'd love to chat with, and unfortunately it's just not something that we get to do very often. And even in preparing this presentation, being able to go back and I asked Barry if he would come tonight. I'm pretty sure he had a tooth extraction, so that is his excuse. But he was going to come and speak to the actual operation of the dry dock. But even hearing him imitate the sound of the pump, it's something that brings it back in a way that reading it can't. And another piece that we have is the dry dock pump. One of the dry dock pumps that's on Heritage Drive, and this is part of the Shipyard Workers Memorial Park. I don't know if in name it's called that anymore, but when it was, when these items were placed there, that's the idea behind it. And again, talking to Barry, he thinks one of those is still buried in the parcel of land between the docks. Which anyone who's looking to develop that could be an interesting piece of information to have before you hit that with something. But again, I don't believe there's any interpretive signage on that piece. There are other pieces down there that do. There's a steam hammer, there's a winch, they have pictures and associated information. But there's something about the dry docks that's been missed. And in preparing this presentation with the help of all the staff at the museum, a lot of pictures to scan. All of those color photographs had not been scanned, so I owe a world of thanks to them for helping with this, but we had a lot of fun putting this together. And again, I don't know of anything that's really beyond. David Buxton did write an article for the Enterprise Bulletin called Collingwood Head to Dry Docks. And short of that, I don't know really of anything that's written about the dry docks specifically. So if you ever come across anything about the dry docks or a photograph that you'd like to share, just for reference purpose even, we love to see it because we're always trying to compile the pieces that have somehow not been documented because no one asked the question or no one thought to do it. But we're always looking for help, and if you have anything, we'd love to hear from you. And after saying that there isn't a lot of information about all of this, I'm happy to entertain questions even though I don't know how well I'll be able to speak to them, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to attempt to answer them for you. Yeah?
It's not a question, but you might want to check with Arnott Construction because they did the work for the latest cofferdam. They might have some pictures or something.
Oh, did they?
They did the work, yes.
Interesting. We have no idea who did that. Thank you for that.
And the stone cover came from McQueen Quarry.
The stone cover?
The stone cover on that came from McKean's Quarry up in True.
Oh, interesting. Oh.
And it was just borrowed.
It was borrowed. Fascinating. Yeah.
Melissa, some years ago, we happened to fly over the harbor when the water was very low. And the pilot flying that little plane, and it was just outside, I'm not sure which of those dry docks, there was what looked like the ribs of a ship actually down in the water. And so after inquiring about it, he said that that was likely remnants of one of the gates.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, it's believed to be the gate from Dry Dock 2.
Really? And it's
Yeah.
just sitting at the bottom of the bay.
Yeah. Because it stopped being used in the late 50s sometime, and that one is believed to be in the harbor. And then we did see the pictures of the gate being taken to the dump for the first one. But, and I believe that new gate that was constructed in 1981 was actually purchased by another shipyard. It was relocated, it wasn't scrapped. But yeah, there is an aerial photograph. I remember Christine Cowley, she showed me that photograph when she was writing her history, Butchers, Bakers, and Building the Lakers. And it does look like a shipwreck, but it is believed to be one of the gates from Dry Dock number 2.
I did see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have a picture of it?
No.
I have to find the picture, and I didn't know who took the picture, so I didn't want to use it in the presentation without the permission, but yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I meant to mention that. Yeah?
Just that little piece about the fish.
Yeah.
The conservation officer aspect came in very late. Apparently one of the great bonuses of working at the yard was when they heard that pump go. Everybody recognized that the next 4 hours, grab a basket and get So the fish were distributed liberally in the town.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't mention, I asked Barry how long, and I don't think it was on there, but how long it took to pump the dock. And he said it would be between 6 to 8 hours. He did, okay, good. And in the earliest accounts of the 1883 dock, it was about that same time. It took that long. So I'm fascinated by how similar the operation of the structures were, even, 103 years apart. But, yeah.
Yes, I'm a shipwright, trained in Bolton, Top Gun. And I entered into my apprenticeship and signed in with the document that your father had to Campbell's on, and I've still got that. One thing I'd like to mention was launching a ship as well as hauling it out.
Mm-hmm.
I was lucky enough as an apprentice to be at a launching, and was surprised the amount of work that went into it, because all the ways was waxed with grease, and the ship was then slowly raised on wedges, and you would have a team of shipwrights, and at the word they go and start hammering away, keeping it all together. As wages were driven home, they raised the ship up, and then they could take out alternate wedges, so that there was only a few wedges holding the ship. And that was very carefully done. There was a wire stretched across the dock. There was a bit of ragma at the centre, and the props that held the ship up, I might say they were all Canadian fur.
Yeah.
Never seen it here since.
Was that in Collingwood? You got to witness that?
In Collingwood.
Yeah.
And I also added to that is the fact that for 5 years when I did my apprenticeship, I cycled past HMS Collingwood. And it was a naval establishment, but during the war it was a very active place. But that's where I did my 5-year apprenticeship, and still look back.
Wow. We're working on an exhibit at the museum about the side launch. So I will get your information after the meeting, because we have lots of questions, and depending on what position someone works in at the shipyard, sometimes they can't answer our questions. And sadly, Gordon Thomas, the last launch master, he just passed away within the past couple weeks, and he was on my list of people to interview, and I didn't get there in time, sadly. But yeah.
Did you also document accidents happening during launching?
As part of this presentation?
Just for yourself?
There is a memorial at, no, I have not done that specifically. Sonny Potts and Jim Cousins, they did a lot of research that resulted in a memorial being put up, a granite memorial along that Shipbuilders Park on Heritage Drive, with the names of, there's over 100 people, and that's from the shipyards. I believe there's over 100, I may be adding a few there. But that's from the beginning of the shipyard onward, anyone that they can find. But certainly the 1969 launch of the Tadoussac is one that...
And I remember that.
Yeah.
I was teaching in Stainer, and there were a couple of students whose fathers were at the in the accident at that time.
Yeah, for anyone who doesn't know, that ship, that was launched in 1969, and it launched about 15 minutes too early, and a lot of the men were caught underneath, and 2 men died as a result of that accident. We do, I've mentioned Sonny Potts' name. He was a diver, and he donated a piece of rope from that launch that was saved by someone involved who cut the rope, and he saved it as, I don't think it was a memorial, but as part of that day. So we have that at the museum now, and there has been a book written about that launch by Jeff Potts, and we do have that at the museum. I haven't had a chance to go all the way through it, but he interviewed as many workers as he could who were involved in that launch to try to get the story, because his father was involved. But yeah, horrible day, and a very dangerous industry. We look back on it, you know, we look at the lovely colored photographs of the launch, and we have a brewery named after the side launch. But the reality and the dangers of that industry were very real, and when you start to chat with the workers, those inevitably come out with the fun stories and all the jokes and their nicknames, which are sometimes fun and interesting. But yeah, it definitely was a dangerous place. And this many years after the closure, we seem to have a very different perspective back on it, particularly those who weren't. I never saw a ship launch, and I had relatives who worked at the shipyard, but I was too young I didn't know them. They passed away before I could chat with them, but yeah.
So
Yeah.
you could always tell the rookie watchers when they were having a side launch. They were the ones that stepped down, and you knew. Anyone who was experienced got to high ground, but the rest of them, the wash would take them and get them a little on the wet side.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Eleanor?
I've got a related fish story.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has a fish story. I was in the Panama Canal heading west. They had drained one of the locks, and we were on high water in the double lock. And we looked down, and they had a small lake at the bottom, and there was no work being done at the canal that day. Everybody was down there, and the fish in that pond had to be 20, 30 pounds. I mean, they were huge fish.
Wow.
Yeah, and these guys, there was a huge crowd there, and they were just running from everywhere to grab these huge fish. And they were up to their waist in salt water down there grabbing these fish.
Wow.
It was amazing, amazing sight.
Any other questions? Thank you very much for having me.